The torchlight flickers against the stone walls of an embalming workshop in ancient Memphis. The air is thick, cedar resin, sharp natron salt, something older and darker beneath it all. On the table before them lies a body, and the men working around it are not performing a burial. They are performing an act of salvation. The ancient Egyptians did not simply dispose of their dead. They believed the physical body was the permanent anchor of the soul. Without it, preserved and intact, the spirit dissolved into nothing. Eternity was forfeit. That belief drove them to develop one of the most sophisticated preservation systems the ancient world ever produced. For centuries, we thought we understood it. Texts, tomb paintings, the accounts of ancient historians, they gave us the outline. But the true chemistry, the precise science of exactly how and why it worked, remained out of reach. Until now. Because modern forensic analysis has done something remarkable. It has given us proof. To understand why the ancient Egyptians developed one of history's most elaborate preservation systems, you first have to understand what they believed was at stake. This was not sentiment. It was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was theology with consequences. Specific, terrifying, permanent consequences. The ancient Egyptians did not see death as an ending. They saw it as a threshold, a temporary interruption between one form of existence and the next. But crossing that threshold successfully required conditions. The most fundamental of those conditions was this: the physical body had to survive. Their understanding of the human spirit was not simple. They divided it into distinct components, each with its own nature and its own needs. The Ka was the life force, the animating energy that inhabited the body during life and needed to return to it after death. The Ba was closer to what we might call personality or individual identity, capable of movement, capable of leaving the tomb, but always needing a physical home to return to. And the Akh was the transformed, glorified spirit that could achieve true immortality, but only if the Ka and Bia remained anchored to a preserved physical form. Remove that anchor, allow the body to decay, and the entire spiritual architecture collapsed. The soul did not simply weaken, it was lost, permanently. This was the operating logic of an entire civilization across more than 3,000 years. Every tomb built, every ritual performed, every spell inscribed on every wall of every burial chamber was downstream of this single conviction. The body must not rot. Woven through all of it was the concept of Me'at. Usually translated as truth or justice, Me'at was something closer to cosmic order, the invisible principle that held the universe in its correct and functioning arrangement. A proper burial, a properly preserved body, was an act of participation in that order. It kept things right. A body abandoned to decomposition was not merely a family tragedy. It was a small tear in the fabric of the cosmos itself. Now consider what that means for the people tasked with preventing it. The embalmers of ancient Egypt were not simply craftsmen. They were the last line of defense between a human soul and oblivion. The pressure that placed on their methods, their materials, their precision was absolute. Failure was not a professional setback. It was a cosmic one. And yet, for all the documentation that survives, the tomb paintings showing the process, the ancient texts describing it, the accounts left by foreign historians who observed it, one thing remained stubbornly, frustratingly unclear. We knew the steps. We knew the rituals. But the actual chemistry, the precise science of which materials were chosen and exactly why they worked at a molecular level, was knowledge that died with the embalmers themselves. That is the gap that modern science has now crossed. And what it found on the other side is more sophisticated, more deliberate, and more extraordinary than anyone had fully anticipated. For generations, what we knew about mummification came from two main sources: the accounts of outsiders who witnessed or described the process, and the evidence left behind in the tombs themselves. Together, they gave us a framework, a sequence of steps, a set of materials, a broad picture of an extraordinarily involved procedure. What they could not give us was the chemistry beneath it. But before we get to what science revealed, we need to understand exactly what that framework contained. Because the process itself, even stripped of its molecular secrets, is remarkable. It began with washing. The body was cleansed in a mixture of water and natron salt, an act that was simultaneously practical and ceremonial. Purification of the physical form before the work of preservation could begin. Then came the step that has unsettled observers for centuries: the removal of the brain. A long, hooked instrument was inserted through the nostril, used to break up the brain tissue, which was then drained out and discarded. Not preserved, not honored, simply removed and thrown away. To modern eyes, this seems almost barbaric, but to the Egyptians, it was entirely logical. The brain, in their understanding, was not the seat of intelligence or identity. It was irrelevant tissue. Cooling the blood, perhaps. Nothing more. The heart was a different matter entirely. It was left inside the body, carefully undisturbed. Because the heart, in Egyptian theology, was the seat of everything that mattered: memory, emotion, moral identity, the accumulated weight of a person's choices across their lifetime. In the Hall of Judgment, it would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. It had to be present. It had to be intact. The remaining organs were removed through a careful incision in the left side of the abdomen: the liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, each extracted and assigned to one of 4 canopic jars, each jar placed under the protection of one of the 4 sons of Horus. Imsidi, with his human-headed lid, guarded the liver. Hapi, the baboon, protected the lungs. Duamutef, the jackal, watched over the stomach. Kebeh Senuef, the falcon, held the intestines. This was not arbitrary. Every organ had a guardian, a vessel, a designated place in the eternal order of the tomb. The empty body cavity was then packed with myrrh, cassia, and aromatic spices, sewn shut, and buried externally in natron for up to 70 days. After that period, the shriveled, desiccated form was restored. Sawdust and linen were used to rebuild the body's original shape. The skin was oiled. False eyes were set in place, a wig positioned, a resin coat applied across the entire surface. Then came the wrapping, layer upon layer of linen bandage, sometimes hundreds of meters in total, before a sculpted face mask was placed over the head and the body was sealed inside its coffin. This was the procedure as the ancient sources described it: detailed, deliberate, clearly refined over centuries of practice, and yet it raised as many questions as it answered. The texts gave us the skeleton. What they could not give us was the flesh. For all the detail preserved in tomb inscriptions, funerary papyri, and the accounts of ancient historians, the actual practitioners of mummification left almost nothing behind in writing. Herodotus, the Greek historian whose 5th century BC account remains one of our most cited sources, was an outsider, a curious, intelligent outsider, but an outsider nonetheless. He described what he observed and what he was told. He could not describe what he was not shown. And the embalmers, operating within a tradition of closely guarded professional knowledge, showed him only so much. The Egyptian funerary texts were never technical manuals. They were religious documents. They told you what the gods required. They did not tell you the concentration of natron needed to fully desiccate a human body. They did not specify which resin, from which tree, processed in which way, applied at which stage. The men who knew those details learned them through apprenticeship, passed the knowledge mouth to ear across generations, and took it with them when they died. So the questions accumulated, and some of them were deeply unsettling. Why did some mummies survive 4,000 years in near-perfect condition, while others from the same period, from the same region, buried under apparently similar circumstances, crumbled almost immediately upon excavation? If the process was standardized, why were the outcomes so wildly inconsistent? The answer had to lie in the materials, in the specific chemistry of what was applied, in what quantities, at what stages. but without knowing the precise recipes, researchers could only speculate. Then there was the resin problem. Chemical analysis of mummy wrappings and body coatings from different periods revealed enormous variation in resin composition. Some contained compounds that matched known Egyptian plant sources. Others contained substances that had no Egyptian origin at all. Trace compounds identified on mummies from museum collections around the world pointed not toward the Nile Valley, but toward the Mediterranean, toward sub-Saharan Africa, toward regions that would have required extraordinary logistical reach to access. The implications were significant and unresolved. Either the Egyptians were sourcing preservation materials from trade networks of staggering geographic extent, or the identification of those compounds was somehow mistaken. Neither conclusion was comfortable. The brain removal question nagged at researchers differently. Not because the technique was unclear, but because the reasoning behind discarding the brain while preserving the organs in canopic jars seemed internally inconsistent. If preservation was the goal, why was the organ most vulnerable to rapid decomposition simply thrown away? And beneath all of it sat the deepest question of all. Did the ancient Egyptians actually understand why their methods worked? Did they know, in any meaningful sense, the science behind the chemistry they were applying? Or were they following inherited recipes whose mechanisms were invisible to them? These were not small questions, and for a long time, the tools to answer them simply did not exist. Then they did. The breakthrough did not come from a tomb. It came from a workshop. In 2023, archaeologists excavating at Saqqara, the vast ancient necropolis south of Cairo, uncovered something that had no real precedent in the history of Egyptology. An embalming workshop, largely intact, containing ceramic vessels still holding residue from their last use. Not wrappings scraped from a display case, not fragments analyzed from a mummy already processed by decades of museum handling. These were the actual containers used by the actual embalmers, sealed and abandoned and waiting for 2,500 years. Inside them, the chemistry of ancient Egyptian mummification had been sitting undisturbed, waiting to be read. The team applied gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, analytical techniques capable of identifying individual chemical compounds from microscopic residue samples. What they found rewrote the conversation entirely. The resins identified included compounds from coniferous trees, pine and cedar, both of which contain terpene-based molecules with demonstrated and significant antimicrobial properties. These were not ceremonial additions, they were functional. They actively suppress the bacterial activity that drives decomposition. Beeswax was identified in several vessels, a substance that forms a physical barrier against moisture penetration, sealing the outer surface of the wrapped body against the humidity that would otherwise accelerate decay. Animal fats were present, functioning as carrier mediums, helping oil-soluble compounds penetrate the skin and condition the tissue beneath. And in later period samples, bitumen appeared, the dark petroleum-derived substance that gives many surviving mummies their characteristic deep brown coloration and contributes an additional antimicrobial layer. Then came the finding that stopped researchers cold. Some of the compounds identified in those Saqqara vessels had no Egyptian source. Ilimi resin, chemically confirmed in the residue analysis, comes from trees native to tropical Asia and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Dampar resin traces pointed toward Southeast Asian tree species. These were not materials available in the Nile Valley. They were not available anywhere near it. Their presence inside an Egyptian embalming workshop meant one thing with absolute clarity. The ancient Egyptians were operating trade networks of extraordinary geographic reach, sourcing preservation ingredients from thousands of miles away, specifically because those ingredients worked better than anything available locally. This was not accidental. It was deliberate, informed procurement. The natron findings added another layer. Analysis confirmed that natron did not simply dry the tissue through desiccation. It actively altered the biochemical environment of the body, driving the pH so high that bacterial and fungal activity became chemically impossible. It was not a passive salt. It was a precision biochemical intervention. And the brain. The decision to remove and discard it, long interpreted as theological indifference, turned out to have a hard, pragmatic logic. The brain liquefies faster than any other organ. Left inside the skull, it would have compromised the entire preservation effort within days. Removing it was not dismissal, it was damage control. The chemistry worked because the Egyptians understood, empirically and precisely, what they were doing. Not everyone who died in ancient Egypt received the same treatment. That much was always understood. What modern analysis has clarified is precisely how structured that variation was and what it reveals about the society that produced it. Mummification in ancient Egypt was not a single process. It was a spectrum. A sliding scale of preservation quality calibrated to what a family could afford, running from the extraordinarily elaborate to the functionally minimal. And the fact that it existed at all across every tier of society tells you something profound about the civilization. The belief in bodily preservation as the gateway to immortality was not the exclusive property of the ruling class. It was a conviction held broadly enough, urgently enough, that an entire industry evolved to service it at every economic level. At the top of that scale stood the full elite process. The complete organ removal, the canopic jars with their sculpted divine lids, the imported resins, the carefully graded natron treatment lasting the full 70 days, the linen wrapping measured in hundreds of meters, the personalized face mask, the painted wooden coffin, or the stone sarcophagus for those wealthy enough to commission one. This was reserved for pharaohs, high priests, senior officials, and the wealthiest nobles. The cost in materials alone was staggering. The imported cedar and coniferous resins, the elemi, the beeswax, the fine linen, the skilled labor of specialist embalmers working for weeks on a single body. This was not a service. It was an industry unto itself, sustained by Egypt's most powerful institutions. Below that stood a middle tier documented by Herodotus and now chemically confirmed as genuinely distinct in its approach. For those who could not afford the full surgical process, the embalmers offered an alternative. Cedar oil, or in some cases another strongly antimicrobial plant oil, was injected into the body cavity through the rectum, sealing the opening afterward. Over the following weeks, the oil liquefied the internal organs. When the natron period ended and the seal was removed, the dissolved organs drained away, leaving a hollow, chemically treated shell. No incision, no canopic jars, fewer imported materials, a shorter, less labor-intensive process. But a process that still worked. The body still survived. At the base of the scale was the simplest method, a full natron immersion of the intact body, no organ removal, no resins, no surgical intervention of any kind. It was the minimum viable version of the technology. It did not produce the extraordinary longevity of the elite mummies, but it preserved the body well enough to serve its theological purpose, well enough to anchor the soul. What this tiered system represents is something genuinely remarkable. The ancient Egyptians had taken a complex, chemistry-intensive preservation technology and engineered it into a scalable service. The embalmers were not priests administering a sacred mystery to the chosen few. They were skilled professionals running a structured trade, with pricing tiers, specialist knowledge, and a client base that spanned almost the entire society. Immortality in ancient Egypt had a price list. The embalmers are long gone. The workshops are silent. But the mummies themselves have not stopped talking. Every decade that passes brings new analytical tools to bear on collections that have existed in museums for over a century. And with each new tool comes new information extracted from the same preserved tissue that has been sitting in climate-controlled storage, waiting patiently for science to develop the means to ask better questions. C. Scanning transformed mummy research in ways that would have been unimaginable to the Egyptologists who first unwrapped these bodies in the 19th century. Where earlier researchers had to physically disturb the wrappings to examine what lay beneath, CT scanning allows complete internal mapping without touching a single layer of linen. What those scans have revealed is extraordinary. Healed fractures that tell us about accidents survived years before death. severe arterial calcification in individuals who died 3,000 years ago, confirming that heart disease is not a modern invention, but a consequence of certain dietary patterns that reach deep into antiquity. Evidence of arthritis, of dental abscesses, of spinal compression consistent with decades of heavy labor. These are not abstractions. These are individual lives, rendered legible again after thousands of years of silence. Isotope. Analysis of bone and tooth enamel has allowed researchers to reconstruct diet and geographic origin with striking precision. The ratio of specific isotopes absorbed during childhood, locked permanently into the mineral structure of developing teeth, functions as a chemical record of where a person grew up and what they ate. Mummies long assumed to be native Egyptians have been revealed as individuals who spent their childhoods elsewhere, migrants or travelers whose final resting place was far from their place of origin. The ancient world, it turns out, was considerably more mobile than the static picture painted by early archaeology. And then there is the DNA. Ancient DNA, extracted from mummy tissue, has become one of the most powerful tools in the ongoing reconstruction of ancient Egyptian population history. Studies published in recent years have used mummy DNA to trace ancestry, identify familial relationships between individuals buried in the same tomb, and map the genetic impact of successive waves of migration and conquest across 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The mummies are not just preserved bodies, they are archived genomes, each one a data point in a population-level story that is still being written. But perhaps the most quietly astonishing thing is this. Some mummies retain recognizable facial features, skin texture visible to the naked eye, hair still carrying its original color, fingerprints, in several documented cases, still present on fingertips that last pressed against living skin 4,000 years ago. The embalmers sitting in those hot, resin-scented workshops, working through the night by torchlight, were not just following a ritual. They were preserving a face, a person, and in ways they could never have anticipated, using tools they could never have imagined. We are still meeting those people today, still learning their names, still reading their lives. The torchlight, the stone table, the smell of cedar resin and natron hanging thick in the desert air. We are back where we began, but we are not the same audience that arrived here. Because now we know what those substances were doing at a molecular level. We know where the ingredients came from, how far they traveled, and why the chemistry worked. We know the belief that made all of it necessary, and the extraordinary human ingenuity that turned that belief into a technology capable of defeating time itself. The ancient Egyptians looked at death, the most absolute and universal of all human experiences, and refused to accept its finality. They built a science around that refusal, and the proof is lying in museums around the world right now, still wearing its original face. That is not primitive. That is not superstition. That is one of the most remarkable things our species has ever done.